Professor Zethkar's crystalline form shimmered as he gestured toward the holographic display, showing primitive Earth settlements. The lecture hall of the Galactic Academy was filled with students from across the known systems, blue-skinned Altarians, gaseous nebulites contained in their biosuits, and the insectoid Krethak, clicking their mandibles in what passed for laughter. As you can observe, Zethkar's voice resonated through his translucent body. The humans of the 21st century were barely beyond their Stone Age ancestors. Look at these crude structures they called cities, chaotic, inefficient, completely lacking the mathematical precision of true civilization. In the back row, Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As the only human student in the Advanced Galactic History course, she had grown accustomed to being the subject of such academic dissection. The year was 2387, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Confederation for barely 3 decades, newcomers in a galaxy where some civilizations had mastered faster-than-light travel when humans were still discovering fire. Their technology was laughably primitive, Zethkar continued, zooming in on images of early 21st century weapons. Chemical propellants, nuclear fission, they couldn't even harness their own star's energy efficiently. Most amusing of all, they engaged in something called wars over resources that were abundant throughout their solar system. A Krethak student raised a chitinous appendage. Professor, how did such a backward species ever achieve space travel? Zethkar's form pulsed with what Sarah recognized as condescending amusement. Luck student Clickstar. Pure statistical inevitability. Even the most primitive species will eventually stumble upon the basics of physics given enough time. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had remained silent through weeks of these lectures. But something in the professor's tone, the casual dismissal, the assumption that humanity's achievements were mere accidents, finally pushed her past her breaking point. Professor, Sarah said, standing slowly. The lecture hall fell silent. I think you're missing something important about human development. Zethkar's crystalline eyes focused on her with surprise. In 3 decades of teaching, no student had ever interrupted his lectures. Miss Chen, I believe the historical record speaks for itself. Does it? Sarah walked down the steps toward the front of the hall, her footsteps echoing in the silence. You mentioned that humans engaged in wars over resources. You present this as evidence of our primitiveness, but I think you've fundamentally misunderstood what you're observing. She stopped at the podium, looking up at the towering professor. May I? Zethkar gestured to the holographic controls, his form flickering with curiosity despite himself. Sarah manipulated the display, pulling up a timeline of human conflict. You see warfare and assume irrationality. But look closer. The hologram shifted, showing battle formations from ancient Rome, medieval siege warfare, Napoleonic tactics, World War II strategies, and finally, modern military operations. This isn't random violence, Professor. This is evolution in real time. Every single conflict taught us something new about logistics, strategy, resource management, technology development, and, most importantly, coordination under extreme stress. She zoomed in on a HFY battlefield. This conflict alone accelerated human technological development by decades. Radar, computers, jet engines, rocket technology, nuclear physics, all born from the crucible of warfare. But more than that, Sarah's voice grew quieter, more intense. It taught us how to mobilize entire civilizations toward a single goal. An Altarian student spoke up, her melodic voice tinged with confusion. But surely, Miss Chen, this proves human primitiveness. Civilized species resolve conflicts through negotiation, through the Council of Voices, through bureaucracy, Sarah interrupted, turning to face the class. Through committees and subcommittees and decades of debate. Tell me, how long did it take the Galactic Council to decide on standardized currency? 200 years? How long to establish trade routes with the Andromeda systems? 50 years of negotiations? She turned back to the display, pulling up more recent human history. When the Zephyrian plague threatened to wipe out 17 worlds, how long did the Council take to organize a response? 18 months of debate, committee formation, and resource allocation discussions. Sarah's fingers flew over the controls. Humans organized a response fleet in 6 weeks. Not because we're more intelligent or more advanced, but because 10,000 years of warfare taught us something that peaceful species never learned. How to mobilize everything we have, immediately when extinction is on the line. The room was dead silent now. Even Professor Zethkar had stopped flickering. You call us primitive because we fought over resources, Sarah continued, her voice now carrying an edge that made several students shift nervously. But what you're really seeing is a species that spent millennia being tested by scarcity, by competition, by the constant threat of annihilation. Every human generation faced existential challenges that most galactic species can't even conceptualize. She pulled up an image of early human space programs. You think we stumbled onto space travel through luck? Professor, humans went from first flight to walking on our moon in 66 years. The Altarians took 800 years to achieve the same progression. The Krethak took over 1,000. Sarah's eyes swept across the lecture hall. You want to know why humans adapted to galactic civilization so quickly? Why we went from primitive to Confederation members in just 30 years? It's because we're the only species in this galaxy that evolved from predators. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Every other species here evolved from prey animals or symbiotic relationships or peaceful environmental adaptation. You've spent millions of years learning to cooperate, to negotiate, to find peaceful solutions. Sarah's smile was sharp, predatory. Humans spent millions of years learning to hunt things that could hunt us back. She gestured to the display showing modern human colonies. You see primitive warfare, Professor. I see a species that learned to coordinate lethal force across vast distances, to innovate under pressure, to make impossible decisions with incomplete information, and to sacrifice everything for survival. Sarah's voice dropped to just above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent hall. You've been wondering how humans achieved space travel so quickly, how we adapted to galactic politics so easily, how we've managed to establish ourselves as essential members of the Confederation in just 3 decades. She looked directly at Professor Zethkar. It's because we're not like you. We're not a civilization that grew up in safety, that had the luxury of slow, peaceful development. We're a species that clawed its way up from the bottom of the food chain by being smarter, faster, and more ruthlessly adaptable than anything that tried to kill us. The holographic display shifted one final time, showing human colonies scattered across dozens of star systems, human-designed ships in Confederation fleets, human administrators in galactic government positions. So when you call us primitive, Sarah concluded, returning to her seat with measured steps, remember that primitives don't usually conquer the galaxy in 30 years. They don't usually become indispensable to civilizations millions of years older than them, and they don't usually make their professors question everything they thought they knew about the nature of advancement. The lecture hall remained silent for a long moment. Professor Zethkar's crystalline form had stopped flickering entirely. Finally, a young Nebulite student spoke, their voice barely a whisper through their biosuit speakers. Professor, how many human colonies are there now? Zethkar's voice, when it came, sounded hollow. 743. In 30 years. Another student, this time a Krethak. And how many species has humanity incorporated into the Confederation since joining? 15, Zethkar replied mechanically. Sarah smiled as she sat down, but there was no warmth in it. Class dismissed? The professor nodded slowly, his form finally beginning to flicker again, but now it seemed less like amusement and more like nervous energy. As students filed out in unusual quiet, Sarah heard whispered conversations in a dozen languages, all asking variations of the same question. What else don't we know about humans? Sarah remained seated until the hall was empty except for her and Professor Zethkar. The old historian approached her slowly. Miss Chen, he said, his voice carefully neutral. That was illuminating. Sarah looked up at him. Professor, you've been studying human history for 3 decades. Did you really think we got here by accident? Zethkar's form pulsed once slowly. I'm beginning to suspect, he said quietly, that human history is far more terrifying than I realized. Sarah stood, gathering her materials. Professor, she said as she walked toward the exit, you have no idea. The last thing Zethkar saw before she left was her smile, and for the first time in his 1,000-year lifespan, the elderly historian understood what it meant to be prey.